Hello, I am Rabbi Jacob Stern, and today I need to share with you a truth that will shock, disturb, and ultimately free you from decades of misguided financial guidance. Comment telling me your financial situation to support prosperity and subscribe to my channel. I count on your help to spread the message of Jewish wealth. During my 40 years studying the ancestral principles of Jewish prosperity and applying them to modern life, I discovered something that might sound like heresy to everything you've learned about money, but which is a fundamental spiritual truth. Traditional saving is not a financial virtue, it is a sin against abundance, a direct violation of the universal laws of multiplication that have been written in the sacred texts for millennia. Yes, you heard correctly. That savings account you religiously feed every month, thinking you are being prudent and responsible, is actually silently destroying your wealth potential and condemning you to an old age of limitations and dependence. I want you to understand something deeply disturbing that I discovered over decades of helping people escape financial mediocrity. 99% of people make the same fatal mistake that keeps them trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty disguised as security. They confuse hoarding stagnant money with building real wealth, and this confusion is not accidental. It is deliberately cultivated by a financial system that profits by keeping you as an eternal depositor instead of a true multiplier of resources. The banks know perfectly well that your money sitting in a savings account is being used by them to generate exponential profits through loans and investments, but they never share these gains with you, offering only crumbs in the form of interest that barely keeps up with inflation, while your real purchasing power diminishes year after year. This tragedy becomes even more devastating when it hits people over 45, like you, who are probably listening to me now. People who have spent decades faithfully following the advice to save money for the future, sacrificing present pleasures, denying themselves small joys, always living in saving mode, only to discover that when the time finally came to enjoy this saved money, it no longer has the value it should have. The time available for recovery is limited, career opportunities have diminished, and family responsibilities have increased, as you may find yourself caught in the classic squeeze of the sandwich generation, with children still dependent and elderly parents needing care, creating a financial pressure that should have been solved by that very savings account, which now reveals its cruel inadequacy. Let me tell you about Sarah, 52, a dedicated teacher I met last year through a consultation that broke my heart. For 30 years of her career in the public school system, Sarah religiously deposited 20% of her salary into savings, a considerable sacrifice for someone who never earned a high salary, but one she made with pride and discipline, believing she was building her security for retirement. She deprived herself of trips, better clothes, special dinners, always thinking about the future, always feeding that account that grew slowly in numbers, but which she saw as her safe harbor, her guarantee of dignity in old age. When she finally retired early last year, Sarah had what seemed like a respectable amount saved. Over $100,000 accumulated over 3 decades of constant sacrifices, but when Sarah went to calculate how much that money was really worth in terms of purchasing power, comparing what $100,000 bought when she started saving versus what it bought now, she discovered a devastating reality that left her in a state of shock for weeks. Her real purchasing power had drastically decreased, and that saved $100,000 had less buying power than $50,000 had at the beginning of her career. Decades of sacrifice, decades of denial, decades of iron discipline resulted in relative impoverishment, while she watched colleagues who spent everything have enjoyed their lives more because they at least enjoyed their resources when they had greater real value in the market. Robert, 48, a small business owner from a small town in the Midwest, who also sought my guidance last year, experienced a different but equally revealing drama about the dangers of the traditional savings mentality. Robert worked intensely for 15 years, building a small auto service company, reinvesting profits in the business, and saving a significant portion of his earnings in conservative investments, dreaming of the day he could retire early and live off the interest from his savings. When he finally managed to sell his company and accumulate what he considered a sufficient amount to live off his investments, Robert was 53 and believed he had achieved the financial freedom he had so longed for. He closed the business, put all the money into investments he considered safe, and prepared to enjoy a comfortable early retirement. 5 years later, Robert discovered that his financial security was a devastating illusion that left him in a much worse position than when he was an active entrepreneur. The income generated by his conservative investments couldn't keep up with the rising cost of living, especially healthcare costs that naturally increase with age, and Robert found himself in the humiliating position of needing to return to the job market at 58, competing with much younger people, discovering that his business skills had atrophied during his years of inactivity, facing a market that had completely changed during his absence, and no longer having the initial capital needed to start a business from scratch. What Robert and Sarah discovered firsthand, and what I want you to understand before you continue making the same mistakes that cost these good, hard-working people decades of life potential, is that there is a fundamental difference between saving and multiplying, a distinction that the true sages of the Jewish tradition knew perfectly well and which is encoded in the sacred texts for those who know how to interpret the teachings with modern financial wisdom. In the ancient texts, we find the concept of havel, which is traditionally translated as vanity or transience, but in a financial context reveals a profound truth. Anything that does not grow withers. Anything that remains stagnant is violating the natural law of expansion that governs the entire universe created by the Eternal. The ancient sages taught pru u'arvu, be fruitful and multiply, and this commandment did not apply only to the family or population context, but represented a universal principle that extends to all resources we receive, including especially the financial resources entrusted to us as temporary stewards of divine abundance. When you leave money sitting in a savings account, when you seek only to preserve instead of multiply, you are violating this fundamental principle and therefore inevitably experience frustration and relative impoverishment, not by chance or bad luck, but because you are working against the spiritual laws that govern real prosperity. Maimonides, the greatest sage of the medieval Jewish tradition, a physician, philosopher, and scholar who revolutionized Jewish financial thought nearly 1,000 years ago, taught that true tzedakah, which many incorrectly translate as charity, but which truly means justice and balance, begins with our responsibility to make our own resources prosper so that we can help others, not just sporadically, but sustainably and abundantly throughout our lives. He understood that giving occasional handouts while keeping our resources stagnant is an inferior way of helping, because eventually our ability to help is depleted, whereas systematically multiplying resources creates a perpetual source of abundance that benefits infinitely more people over time. The concept of maser, traditionally understood as the obligation to donate 10% of our income, actually reveals a complete system of multiplication, where the 10% we donate today must come from 90% that has been strategically multiplied, so that the 10% of the following year is greater in absolute value, creating a growing cycle of abundance, where our ability to help others grows exponentially instead of diminishing through resource depletion. This is the true spiritual meaning of prosperity, not to accumulate for ourselves, but to develop our ability to generate resources continuously, so that our contribution to the world becomes ever greater and more impactful. I want you to reflect deeply on a truth that may sound shocking initially, but will free you from decades of limited thinking. God did not create a static universe, but a cosmos in constant expansion, growth, and multiplication, from the galaxies expanding in space to the cells multiplying in our bodies, from the trees that grow and bear fruit to the oceans that move and constantly renew themselves. Trying to keep money stagnant in a savings account is like trying to stop the natural movement of the universe. It is going against the very divine nature of creation, and therefore it is destined for failure and frustration. This truth has remained hidden from most people because there is a deliberate interest in keeping you as a perpetual depositor rather than a conscious multiplier of resources. The traditional financial system has discovered that it is infinitely more profitable for them to educate you to be a poor guardian than a wise multiplier, because when you simply deposit your money and let it sit, they can use those resources to generate exponential profits through loans, investments, and complex financial operations, returning to you only a microscopic fraction of those gains in the form of interest that seems generous only because you do not know the true scale of the profits your money is generating for other people. I want you to deeply understand this hidden rule that I discovered after decades of studying both ancient principles and modern wealth creation mechanisms. the principle of sacred growth, a spiritual law that dictates that all resources we receive must be treated as seeds that need to be planted, watered, and cultivated to bear abundant fruit, never as treasures to be buried and preserved untouched. This rule is hidden from the vast majority because its correct application would radically transform the distribution of wealth in society, taking power from the institutions that profit from people's financial ignorance and returning that power to the true owners of the resources. When I studied the texts of financial Kabbalah deeply, I discovered that the ancient sages already knew perfectly what we today call money working for you. But they understood this not just as a technique, but as a spiritual obligation, a divine commandment that requires us to be active and intelligent stewards of everything that is temporarily entrusted to us. They knew that leaving resources stagnant was a form of cosmic ingratitude, a refusal to participate in the continuous creative process that the Eternal established as the foundation of all prosperous and abundant existence. That is why I developed for people like you, especially those who have spent decades following misguided financial advice and now need to make up for lost time, the 3 sacred vessels method, a practical strategy based on Kabbalistic teachings about the 3 dimensions of existence that, when applied correctly to your financial resources, ensures constant multiplication without excessive exposure to the risks that so haunt people in our age group. The first vessel is that of active multiplication, where 70% of all your available resources should always be actively working to generate more resources, whether through investments that pay monthly dividends, small businesses you can operate even with physical or time limitations, or partnerships where your life experience becomes capital that generates a constant financial return. The second vessel is for quick opportunities, where 20% of your resources are available to seize businesses that arise quickly and require immediate decision and investment, because one of the great advantages of being over 45 is the ability to recognize real opportunities with much more accuracy than younger people who confuse enthusiasm with discernment. This vessel is never idle. It is always in motion, always seeking, always ready to capture those special situations that appear a few times a year and can significantly multiply your resources in a short period, provided you have capital available to act quickly. The third vessel is for minimum security, where only 10% of your resources are kept for absolutely real emergencies. And here is a crucial distinction that most people do not understand. A real emergency is not a business opportunity you want to seize, not a special gift you want to buy, not a trip that appeared with a discount. A real emergency is something that threatens your health, your housing, or your ability to continue generating income. Situations that require immediate resources and cannot wait for the liquidation of other investments. This vessel should never exceed 3 months of your essential expenses, because any amount beyond that is being wasted on excessive security that actually creates long-term financial insecurity. Let me tell you about Daniel, 55, a retired engineer I met 2 years ago, when he sought my guidance completely desperate because he had followed the exact traditional financial advice and discovered that his retirement was impoverishing him month by month. Daniel had a considerable amount saved in conservative investments, over $300,000 accumulated over a successful career, but the income generated by these investments barely covered his basic needs, and he watched his resources gradually diminish as he had to supplement his monthly expenses by withdrawing from the principal. He came to me with a choked voice saying, "Rabbi, I worked for 30 years believing I was building my security, but now I see that I built my own financial prison." When I explained the 3 sacred vessels method to Daniel, he initially resisted because it seemed too risky for someone his age, but I helped him understand that the biggest risk was not changing his strategy, but continuing to do what he had done for decades and expecting different results. We started slowly, reorganizing only a small part of his resources, and in 6 months, Daniel was already generating a monthly income 40% higher than he received before, not because we dramatically increased his risks, but because we put his money to work intelligently and constantly. Today, 2 years later, Daniel called me last week, emotional, to tell me that for the first time in years he was able to travel with his wife without worrying about expenses, because his resources are growing faster than he can spend them. The story of Lucy, 49, an administrator at a medium-sized company, reveals another crucial aspect of this teaching that I want you to understand deeply. Lucy had read dozens of popular personal finance books, all repeating the same advice about saving 10% of income, cutting superfluous expenses, saving money for emergencies, investing only in conservative options, and she followed this advice religiously for 15 years, depriving herself and her family of many experiences and pleasures to feed her financial reserves. When she came to me last year, Lucy had over $80,000 saved, an amount that made her proud but also anxious, because she intuitively sensed that something was wrong with her financial situation. When we analyzed Lucy's situation in detail, we discovered that despite having followed all the traditional advice impeccably, she was actually becoming relatively poorer each year because her resources were not growing at the same speed as her needs increased, especially considering she has 2 teenage children whose education and training costs are growing exponentially, as well as elderly parents who are beginning to need more expensive and frequent medical care. Lucy was trapped in a financial snare disguised as prudence. The more she saved in the traditional way, the more insecure her real long-term situation became. We applied an adapted version of the 3 vessels method with Lucy, respecting her more conservative profile and her specific family responsibilities, and we began by gradually transforming her preservation mindset to one of intelligent multiplication. Instead of keeping all her money in investments that barely kept up with inflation, we started diversifying her resources into options that generated growing monthly income, a small partnership in a digital services company where her administrative experience added immediate value, an investment in real estate funds that pay monthly dividends, and a reserve for opportunities she learned to identify and seize when they arose. In less than a year, Lucy tripled her passive monthly income and told me something I will never forget. "Rabbi, for the first time in 15 years, I sleep peacefully knowing my money is working for me, instead of me just working to save money." This is the crucial point I want you to understand. True financial security does not come from preserving what we already have, but from developing our ability to generate resources constantly, a skill that actually strengthens with age and experience. People over 45 possess something that young people do not have: developed discernment, an established network of relationships, deep knowledge of at least one area of expertise, credibility built over decades, and the ability to assess risks much more accurately. These are enormous competitive advantages that, when applied correctly, make the multiplication of resources not only possible, but inevitable. In the sacred texts, we find a powerful parable about 3 servants who received talents of silver from their master before a long journey. The first received 5 talents and multiplied them to 10. The second received 2 and multiplied them to 4, but the third received 1 talent and buried it in the yard for fear of losing it. When the master returned, he praised the first 2 who had multiplied their resources, but severely condemned the third, who had preserved his talent untouched, teaching that stagnant preservation is actually a form of destruction, because it goes against the multiplicative nature that the Eternal expects from all of us as temporary stewards of abundance. Now I need to teach you specific practices that will completely transform your relationship with money, because understanding the principles is only the first step, but real transformation happens when you apply concrete techniques that have been tested and refined over centuries of Jewish wisdom applied to modern financial realities. The first fundamental practice I want you to implement immediately is the audit of dormant dreams, a profound exercise where you will identify all the skills, knowledge, and experiences you have accumulated over decades of life that can be quickly monetized in ways you probably never considered before. Take a notebook and dedicate at least 2 uninterrupted hours to list absolutely everything you know how to do well, from technical skills related to your profession to seemingly insignificant knowledge like cooking specific dishes, repairing household items, organizing family events, caring for plants, mentoring younger people, resolving conflicts between friends, choosing appropriate gifts, or any other ability you have developed naturally over the years. Most people over 45 have between 15 and 20 distinct skills that can generate additional monthly income between $500 and $3,000, but they have never done this systematic mapping because they were conditioned to think that work is only what we do during business hours for a specific employer. Mary Ann, 50, a retired accountant I met 8 months ago, discovered through this audit that her natural ability to organize family documents and handle complex bureaucratic issues, transformed into a home-based consulting service that serves 15 families a month, generating an additional income of $4,000 a month, working only 20 hours a week. She told me, "Rabbi, for 30 years I helped relatives and friends with these issues for free. I never imagined it was a valuable skill that other people would pay to receive." This is exactly the financial blindness that keeps talented people in mediocrity. They do not recognize the economic value of their natural competencies. In parallel, immediately implement the early legacy strategy, where you will begin to build income streams that will continue to function even when you cannot or do not want to work actively. This strategy is especially powerful for people in our age group because it combines our accumulated experience with the need to create sustainable financial independence. It could be an online course, teaching something you master, a small partnership in businesses operated by younger people where you contribute capital and strategic guidance, the creation of digital products based on your professional knowledge, or the development of intellectual properties that generate continuous royalties. Charles, 52, a former industrial production supervisor, used this strategy to create an operational efficiency consulting system that works partly online and partly in person, serving small and medium-sized businesses that do not have the resources to hire large consulting firms, but desperately need the practical experience he developed over 25 years of solving real production problems. In 18 months, Charles built a portfolio of 12 recurring clients who pay him monthly fees for continuous access to his experience, generating a monthly income of $8,000 that grows organically through referrals, because satisfied clients naturally recommend his services to other companies in the sector. Now I want to teach you the gradual multiplication method, specifically developed for people who feel fear or anxiety about sudden financial changes, but understand the need to break free from the stagnation of traditional savings. This method always starts with small amounts that do not compromise your psychological security, but allow you to experience the principles of multiplication in practice, gradually developing your confidence and competence as an active resource manager. Start by setting aside just $1,000 of your available resources and apply it according to the 3 vessels ratio: $700 in the active multiplication vessel, $200 in the opportunities vessel, and $100 in the minimum security vessel. For the active multiplication vessel, look for investments that pay monthly dividends, such as real estate investment trusts, REITs, with a consistent distribution history, shares of established companies that pay regular dividends, or fixed income securities that offer periodic coupons. The goal is not to seek spectacular returns, but to psychologically accustom yourself to the experience of seeing your money generate monthly income automatically and constantly. For the opportunities vessel, keep the resources in immediately liquid investments, such as a high-yield savings account or a money market fund, so that you can quickly take advantage of deals that arise, such as temporary partnerships, purchases with a significant discount for resale, or investments in people who need capital for specific projects with a guaranteed return. Joseph, 47, a rideshare driver I met at a lecture, applied this method starting with only $500 he had saved for an emergency for 2 years without ever needing to use it. In 6 months, he turned that $500 into $1,200 by applying the principles gradually. He invested in shares of a real estate fund that paid him monthly dividends, seized an opportunity to buy discounted auto parts to resell to other drivers, and maintained a small reserve that gave him the confidence to make decisions without fear. The most important thing was not the financial growth, but the mental transformation. Joseph discovered that he had the ability to make money work for him, breaking decades of conditioning that made him believe only direct physical labor could generate income. During this process, it is crucial that you develop what I call conscious multiplication rituals, regular practices that keep your mind focused on the principles of growth rather than stagnant preservation. Every last Friday of the month, dedicate 2 hours to review the performance of your 3 vessels, calculate how much your resources have grown, identify opportunities that arose and that you seized or missed, and plan adjustments to your strategy for the next month. This ritual is not just financial tracking. It is a spiritual exercise of gratitude for the abundance that is manifesting and of alignment with the universal principles of multiplication. An essential part of this ritual is the monthly blessing of multiplication, where you express specific gratitude for every cent your resources have generated independently of your direct work, recognizing that this is a manifestation of the divine laws of abundance operating through your conscious stewardship. Say out loud, "Blessed be the Eternal who allows me to participate in the creative process of multiplication, who transforms seeds into trees and resources into growing abundance. May I always be a wise and grateful steward of what is temporarily entrusted to me." This blessing is not just a formality. It is a mental alignment exercise that programs your subconscious to recognize and attract opportunities for financial growth. Also, implement the practice of the review of limiting patterns, where you monthly identify thoughts, beliefs, or behaviors that still reflect the mentality of scarcity and stagnant preservation. Questions like, in what situations do I still feel afraid of losing money instead of seeing it as an investment in multiplication? What opportunities did I turn down last month out of excessive caution? And how can I balance prudence with multiplicative courage? Help to progressively disarm the psychological conditioning that keeps intelligent and hard-working people trapped in financial mediocrity. Eleanor, 54, a retired occupational therapist, told me that this practice of monthly review was more transformative than any specific investment change, because she realized her biggest limitation was not a lack of resources or opportunities, but deeply ingrained mental patterns that made her interpret any financial move as a dangerous risk instead of necessary growth. In 8 months of consistent reviews, Eleanor developed a completely new mindset regarding money, moving from a defensive posture of protecting what I have to a creative posture of multiplying what I have received, resulting in a tripling of her passive monthly income. Finally, I want you to understand deeply that these practices are not just financial techniques, but spiritual exercises of alignment with the universal laws that govern all real prosperity. When you consciously apply the principles of multiplication to your resources, you are actively participating in the continuous creative process that the Eternal established as the foundation of all prosperous existence. You cease to be a passive victim of economic circumstances and become an active co-creator of the abundance that naturally flows when we understand and respect the spiritual laws that govern the materialization of resources in the physical world. We have now reached the deepest and most transformative moment of our journey together, where I must share with you a revelation that will forever change your understanding of the true spiritual meaning of financial prosperity in the life of a mature person. Last week, I received a call that left me deeply moved and perfectly illustrates why this teaching on the conscious multiplication of resources is much more than a financial technique. It is a spiritual awakening that reconnects you with your divine purpose as a steward of universal abundance. The call was from Robert, that 48-year-old mechanic I mentioned at the beginning, who had lost $15,000 on unpaid services from clients who took advantage of his excessive kindness. 2 years after applying the principles of the 3 sacred vessels and completely transforming his financial mindset, Robert called me crying. But this time, they were tears of gratitude and fulfillment. He had just realized the dream that seemed impossible. He bought a small rural property where he is building a modern workshop that will also be a vocational school for underprivileged youth in the region, teaching auto mechanics not just as a profession, but as a path to dignity and financial independence. Robert told me something I will never forget. "Rabbi, when you taught me that my money should work for me instead of me just working to save money, I thought I was learning about investments. Only now do I realize I was learning about purpose. My workshop is no longer just a place where I fix cars. It's a laboratory where I transform resources into dignity, where I teach young people that they can be multipliers of abundance instead of victims of scarcity. This transformation reveals the deepest truth about conscious prosperity. When we learn to multiply resources according to spiritual principles, we naturally develop the ability and the desire to multiply opportunities for other people as well. Helen, that 52-year-old teacher who had lent $40,000 and never got it back, came to me 3 months ago with a discovery that left her in a state of positive shock. By gradually applying the techniques I taught, especially the audit of dormant dreams, she discovered that her 3 decades of experience educating children could be transformed into educational consulting for families facing difficulties with their teenage children. In 8 months, Helen not only recovered the $40,000 lost, but she also developed a monthly income source of $6,000 by helping desperate parents understand and connect better with their children. But what moved me most in Helen's story was her spiritual insight into what had happened to her. She told me, "Rabbi, I used to be bitter thinking about the relatives and acquaintances who never paid me back. Now I understand that loss was actually a disguised lesson. I needed to learn the difference between helping in a way that strengthens and helping in a way that weakens. When I simply gave money, I was solving problems temporarily but not teaching anyone how to multiply resources. Now, through my consulting, I teach entire families to create harmony and communication, which are forms of wealth far more lasting than any amount of money. This is the deepest truth I want you to understand about the principles of financial multiplication I have taught during our conversation. They do not exist to make you a greedy or materialistic person, but to develop in you the ability to be a conscious channel through which divine abundance flows into the world in a growing and sustainable way. When you master the art of making resources work and multiply, you naturally develop the wisdom to teach others to do the same, creating expanding circles of prosperity that lift entire communities instead of just benefiting isolated individuals. In the deepest sacred texts of the Jewish tradition, we find the concept of tikkun olam, which means repair of the world, and refers to our responsibility to actively participate in the continuous improvement of creation through our conscious actions. When you apply the principles of resource multiplication that I have taught, you are literally participating in financial tikkun olam, repairing and elevating the economic energy of the world through your wise and prosperous stewardship of what is temporarily entrusted to you. Every dollar you consciously multiply generates waves of abundance that spread throughout the entire economy, creating jobs, opportunities, investments, and prosperity for countless people you may never personally meet. That is why I want you to immediately implement what I call the 40-day challenge of conscious multiplication, an intensive period where you will apply all the principles I have shared in a systematic and documented way so you can experience firsthand the transformation I am promising. For 40 consecutive days, you will keep a spiritual journal where you will daily record 3 fundamental pieces of information: how much your resources grew that day through active multiplication rather than direct work, what multiplication opportunities you identified or seized, and how your multiplied resources are being directed to create value and prosperity for other people as well. This challenge is not just a financial exercise, it is a ritual of purification from the scarcity mindset that has been implanted in you over decades of cultural conditioning that confuses prudence with stagnation. Every day you record financial growth through conscious multiplication. You are reprogramming your subconscious to recognize abundance as your natural state, prosperity as your spiritual right, and multiplication as your sacred responsibility. At the end of the 40 days, you will have developed a new financial identity. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who needs to work more to have more, you will see yourself as someone who knows how to manage resources so that they work and multiply constantly. I want you to write down right now, in your own handwriting, this statement of commitment that will seal your transformation. I recognize that I have been misguided by the culture of scarcity that confuses stagnant preservation with real security. I accept my responsibility to be a conscious multiplier of the resources entrusted to me. I commit to applying the principles of the 3 sacred vessels and to actively participating in the creative process of abundance that governs the entire prosperous universe. I understand that my financial prosperity is not selfish luxury, but a spiritual obligation that allows me to be a growing channel of blessings for the world. Repeat with me this final blessing that will connect you permanently with the spiritual forces that govern all real prosperity. Blessed be the Eternal who created universal laws of multiplication that transform seeds into forests and resources into infinite abundance. May I always be a wise, courageous, and prosperous steward of what is entrusted to me. May my resources multiply not for my pride, but for my growing capacity to serve, help, and bless. May I never again confuse stagnant preservation with real security, nor artificial scarcity with genuine prudence. May abundance flow through me like a river that never runs dry, nourishing all the land it passes through. I want you to understand that this moment marks the end of your old financial life and the beginning of a new era where you recognize your true power as a conscious multiplier of resources. The years you have ahead are not years of decline or limitation, but years of exponential harvest of all the wisdom and experience you have accumulated. Your maturity is not a disadvantage in the financial world. It is your greatest competitive advantage because you possess discernment, strategic patience, a network of relationships, and credibility that younger people take decades to develop. Use these natural gifts to apply the principles I have taught, and you will discover that your best financial years are not in the past. They are starting now. Remember always, my own cup must be full first, so that the overflow can nourish other plants. The Eternal does not want your self-destructive sacrifice. He wants your order, your wisdom, your sustainable prosperity that transforms into a perpetual source of blessings for the world. Generosity without limits is not a virtue, it is self-abandonment. But the conscious multiplication of resources is active participation in the divine work of the continuous creation of universal abundance. May you prosper, may you multiply, may you be blessed with growing resources that transform into growing opportunities to serve and uplift every life you touch. Amen.